Being online gives you a chance to get a taste of a great many different intellects in a short period of time. And it's not just the intellects that are great enough to be famous and published, but also the very mediocre. You get the full bell curve on the internet. You get exposed to the full entire bell curve. And while that has always been true of interaction in the real world, the internet puts it in writing and creates a certain amount, or rather allows for a certain amount of anonymity that gives people the freedom to speak their mind. So to learn the innermost thoughts of people all along the bell curve is kind of an unprecedented thing in as high a volume as you can experience by going online. Now, I'm not saying that I recommend that you read stupid people's rantings. Unfortunately, you're just going to run across it in reading a thread. You're going to, by necessity, have to skim over some idiotic remarks as you look for information of value. When everybody is available to everybody in maybe a lightly moderated format, it really just turns into like a gang fight, because there are like composites, different types of people that hold certain position sets, and they are constantly getting into pissing contests online. It's like the same debate is being had, and by same debate, I can mean any number of different debates that are just being had in perpetuity online all the time. The same arguments rehashed back and forth over and over and over again. Back when message boards were the more predominant method of like online interaction, there was a certain decorum, I guess, that was advised. And one is, if you want to say something, don't go create a new thread right off the bat. Just go look through the threads and do a search and see if the question you want to ask is out there already and been answered, so you don't clog everything up. But nowadays, with so many different channels, it's like the same argument. It's just so redundant. There's just so much redundancy. It's almost like these debates should be identified, and then there should be like the thread to end all threads or something, or they should be merged, like in all the platforms. Just like, you know, get these particular arguments just in one place. I wonder what percentage of the internet is consumed with this handful of debates that's perpetually being rehashed on every platform 24/7. It's actually quite primitive if you really look at it and think about it. Words are just noises, really, right? They're ideas represented by sounds, like bird chirps, right? So the animals, our rantings are just like the birds chirping, right? It doesn't mean anything really, but it does mean something. It's just more complicated in its content. But we are singing the same songs over and over again. We're doing it as routinely as birds. In every spring, they sing the same songs over and over again. And we're really no different. There's no point to all this redundancy. People just need to agree to disagree. The threads can be saved for posterity, there for people to read and decide for themselves. I'm not saying that persuasion is a bad thing per se. I'm not saying that there aren't some ideas that are better than others and they need to be debated, or that they don't need to be debated. I'm saying, yeah, these things are important, but it seems like nobody has ever convinced anybody of anything on the internet. But people do occasionally find for themselves. It's not even that one competing idea has to be true and the other untrue. Oftentimes it's just a question of efficiency Or what's the best mitigation of risk? Or does mitigating this risk introduce another risk that may be even greater? Sometimes there's an argument that perhaps one side just hasn't looked to higher order consequences. Like they're not seeing the next steps beyond. Another source of conflict is that not all sources are trusted. Mark Twain once said, "There's lies, damn lies, and then there's statistics." It is tempting to cook the books. There was a professor at Harvard recently who got in big trouble for fudging data on peer-reviewed papers. And I'm not an academic, but what I've heard is that money has a great deal of influence on research, and moneyed interests can get the studies they want done, and if they don't like the results, they can just re-roll, get a different data set. There are people who have a vested interest in asserting that something is true, something that is actually speculative, that the data supports them. It seems like you could say anything, and there's going to be somebody who's going to come up with some reason why it's not true. Like there's people who will say that, 1 divided by 0 is something other than undefined. And since the internet exposes everybody to everybody potentially, everyone is free to put in their 2 cents. Maybe you've reached this point. I know I have, though. And that is that, yes, I have ideas about what's true, but they've already been said a million times out there. And chances are when I'm looking at any kind of online discussion, my position has already been articulated by somebody else, and I just put a like on their comment. I have frequented a website called Quora for some time. It's a question and answer site. I think I've talked about it before, but it's really kind of mutated into something like any other social media platform. It's just that the structure for associating with people, friending people is different. I guess you just kind of follow instead of having friends. And it still has that skeleton of question and answer, but really it's just like people posting memes and flame wars underneath every single one. But what's interesting about it is that it's very international, and because it's not like you're friending people, you just get it's kind of like a random feed like YouTube, and you get exposed to a lot of conflicts between people groups that you didn't know existed. You don't necessarily know which people groups don't like each other in the world because there's so many people groups. But those conflicts are made known on this website. It's like a cross-section of humanity and like inter-ethnic conflict and political disputes. It's not just ethnicities, but a lot of it is. But also a lot of it is political debates. And all of the shooting wars that are going on are also represented. Now, I'm sure that's the case on every social media platform, but Quora is the one that I happen to visit. So for any one of these folks who are looking at that website, they are also seeing things that are not relevant to their day-to-day experience, right? So just like I see this, others see this in various places in the world. So any given user, when they scroll through, they are bound to see something they disagree with. And so whether or not any piece of content triggers them internally really has to do with their identity. I've talked about culture before as being those behaviors, ideas, practices that make for survival in a given environment. The thing about a culture is that it can fail. So a culture can be maladapted to the environment or find itself in an environment where it's maladapted. Like, for example, the Vikings in their failed attempt to settle Greenland, their lifestyle, their culture, their agricultural practices weren't optimal for that place. But it was a place where humans could survive because there were Inuit who lived there. It takes several generations to know whether or not a culture will sustain. So one difficulty with modernity is that the trajectory of culture is constantly being shifted by technology. To the extent that technology has an impact on chances for survival, it alters the culture. But survival doesn't just mean one generation. Survival is the propagation of the species. And for a people group, that's a facet of the species, a facet that's occupying a certain place at a certain time. But modern technology moves so fast that the cultures that arise from it are obsoleted within a generation. So there's not even a chance to see whether or not a particular mode of living is optimal across multiple generations. It's like we're changing the culture so fast that we're bound to stumble upon something that just destroys us in a very short period of time. There is a certain mechanism beyond just the accumulation of dross between the ears that is pushing humanity. Although that mechanism has its roots in the subtle realm, since it's from only there that ideas can arise, and these are certainly ideas. So when there's an expansion of the money supply through lending, which is how the money supply expands, money's lent into existence. I saw an interview between somebody important in the Treasury and a media person, and this Treasury person sort of stumbled into having to explain how money is created, and he honestly couldn't say. But money is created through lending. So, for example, your local bank, when they make a loan, they're creating money out of thin air through the money multiplier effect, right? To me, this is like Captain Obvious stuff, but maybe you haven't heard it. But when you deposit money, like you deposit $100,000 in the bank, and then they lend that out to somebody, and then that person deposits in a bank, and then that money gets lent out again. So banks typically lend like at or around, sometimes more than the amount of deposits they take on. And when they do that, they need to borrow from either other banks or the Federal Reserve. And they store their excess balances. If like their loan to deposit ratio is less than 1, they store they put those funds in like treasuries. But my point in all this is that when money is lent into existence, it has to grow. Something has to be done with it to pay it back, the principal and the interest. And as I've mentioned in other videos, there's never enough money lent into existence to pay back the principal and the interest, because only the principal is lent into existence. So money seeks to grow because there's going to have to be more of it paid back than was originally borrowed. So there is something of a warrant for human activity that's created through lending. You lend out money and it's going to make people do something. In a way, it's kind of a taskmaster. Economics is fundamentally about human behavior, and the interest rates and money supply are manipulated to influence behavior. Money is valued by its purchasing power, and its purchasing power is a function of its quantity relative to the goods and services available for it to purchase. Whenever there's inflation, it's a monetary phenomenon. That's what Milton Friedman said. It is about the relationship between the quantity of money, the velocity of the money, and the GDP. One thing about technology relative to the money supply is that with the information explosion, the information technology explosion, there are such things as virtual goods. So in an old industrial economy, the GDP relative to the money supply, that denominator, that GDP, was made up of real things that are, converted natural resources, land, things that are mined and harvested, which are quite finite. But with the advent of virtual goods, they can be used as kind of a sponge that absorbs up some of the money spending. So things like OnlyFans, people are spending money on that, or video games. So as long as the economy is still able to produce the things required for survival, the volume of virtual goods purchased can sponge up some of that excess money supply. But ultimately that money has to go somewhere. And people who are rich, they don't just keep all their money in a checking account or even a savings account. They invest it in assets. So if there's a huge increase in the money supply, uh, it's going to be invested in things that either maintain its value, like precious metals, or things that hold value or will appreciate or produce income. And so, with the massive increase in the money supply we saw after the pandemic or during the pandemic, there was tremendous asset inflation. Houses doubled in price or more in some places. Gold's gone from about 2,000 to 3,400 in the last year and a half. So asset prices have increased more than the price of consumer goods. So money flows from the hands of people who earn a wage to those who either own assets or sell virtual goods. And those sop up those dollars, but then those dollars are routed into assets as the recipients of them have to do something with them. And thus that investment motivates work in the same way that the lending motivated work. Although when you have a disconnect between the lending and the assessment of risk in the loan, you can have a rapid destruction of money. So like the housing crisis back in 2008, that was a failure to assess risk. It was a moral hazard where the people underwriting the loans weren't the people who were ultimately carrying the notes, and those notes were packaged up and securitized and AAA rated. The story has been told over and over, but the loans were overvalued, but they were bad loans. So there was a disconnect between the real risk of these loans and the security they purported to have. So they weren't sold at a discount originally. Essentially, they were misrepresented. And so all these bad loans, when they went bad, it destroys the currency that was created in their origination. That's deflationary. And in a deflationary event, there are cascading defaults as, each creditor is stiffed by his debtors and then in turn can't pay their creditors, and the whole thing implodes and the money's destroyed. So pretty much the most important thing to a central banker is to keep that from happening. That's why they would risk hyperinflation rather than deflation. At some point, people are going to want to spend the money that they've accumulated from their asset gains. And then when that happens, I think that's when it trickles into consumer prices, but probably in luxury goods initially. But that money will trickle into the hands of people who will need to spend it on day-to-day things. And so it will eventually catch up. It's not an instantaneous thing. But history shows that it has a tipping point. Once the debt to GDP ratio reaches a certain level, there's just too much debt to pay it off with money that was earned by creating real value. That's when the defaults begin, and then that's when the central bank has to step in and liquefy the system, reliquefy the system. What I'm saying sounds strange, like it's never happened before, but it's happened, dozens, if not hundreds of times. No fiat currency regime has lasted more than 100 years, and ours began about over 50 years ago. So we will see whether or not virtual goods have any effect in delaying the monetary problems associated with an explosion of debt. One thing's for certain, though, that the more debt that there is to pay off, the more human activity is required to generate things of value to get the liquidity to pay it off. So perhaps with the development of agentic AI and robots, productivity can be increased to where the debt to GDP ratio that causes a problem increases. But then the question is, who will consume all this stuff that was created by robots who had to create that stuff to justify the paper that was lent into existence? Since human workers will be cut so much out of the loop, there'll need to be a way to distribute these goods and services that doesn't leave the vast majority of humanity out and just a few in. It's like we'll need a new kind of economics. But the thing about the world is when you look at it, there are many, many places where people are quite content to live in opulence while others in close proximity to them live in extremely rough conditions. But hey, maybe that's the plan.